Hello everybody, my name is Brady and we are back with another React video, and today we're going to be checking out more extra history. Today we're going to be doing more Justinian and Theodora, which is always fun. This title has me intrigued because it just says Theodora. It doesn't say Justinian and Theodora. All the titles before this were Justinian and Theodora. Whether Theodora was involved or not. And there are some episodes she's just not at all involved in, but she's not cut out of the title. But I looked at the last few episodes. We have Theodora, then the next episode is Justinian and Theodora again. Then the last one is just Justinian. And I believe Theodora dies before Justinian does. So that last one makes a little bit more sense, but just having Theodora in this one kind of alone is really interesting. And I had to double check to make sure this wasn't some separate series on Theodora. It's not. So that's kind of fascinating, and I'm curious. Clearly she's going to be at the forefront here, but the omission of Justinian here is not for any like character shortage in like the title, because you have like a character limit when you make a YouTube title. It isn't because of that. This is like an artistic decision, so that's kind of interesting. So this is going to be a little different, I'm sure. We've been hanging around on like the military side of things, and that's cool and all, but I'm curious to what spheres Theodora can occupy within this system. That's something that I've been wondering about this whole time, and we haven't gotten as much of her. And I think that's the one thing that's been kind of a shame so far, but I'm sure there's plenty, and I'm excited to see what we have here.
As the great empires battled in the scorched plains of the Middle East, a new threat began to creep its way onto the scene. It was at first a small thing, a local thing. A man in Pelusium dies. But this death served merely as the starting bell, the catalyst for a time of chaos and dread. A darkness reached out from the borders of Egypt and unleashed a horror never before seen on the world. That man in Pelusium had at first felt only a fever, but then a strange fog descended on his mind, accompanied by a swelling of great black pustules on his thigh. Then he began to vomit blood, and his skin began to decay while he still lived. He had the plague. This outbreak in Pelusium is the first recorded instance in world history of the plague. But still, Pelusium was a somewhat isolated place. Sure, rumors began to spread across the empire of a town transformed into a living hell, but at first they were only rumors, horror stories to share at night. But then the plague moved up to Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt, and that horror became very real.
You know, I kind of knew the timeline that we were working with, roughly, but I didn't even really factor in the potential impact of the plague. And this is so early on. Like, I never really think about the plague because it doesn't really come up in my area of study. Like, 19th century America, that you don't really get a whole lot of plague there. You might get your own little sort of plagues, but nothing quite like this. So I've especially not seen a lot of like the early impact of the plague. A lot of the plague stuff that I have like incidentally encountered is like late stage stuff. But this is actually a pretty fascinating twist already.
Great port city of Alexandria fell into chaos. No medicine or prayer could stop the ravages of the disease. People spoke of the end times, of the wrath of God, and people died. Unfortunately, Alexandria was one of the great ports of the ancient world. It was a center of trade. It provided grain to the greatest cities of Eastern Rome. And so from there, from port to port, the Great Plague made its way across the Roman world. In 542, it reached Constantinople. The horrors it inflicted cannot be overstated. 1 in 4 people in the great city died. Like, imagine that. Imagine if 1 out of every 4 people you knew just vanished. Imagine what it does to an economy, to the functions of trade and of state. How does a world run when suddenly, for no rhyme or reason, 1/4 of its people are snatched up by the jaws of death? And
this has aged a little weird. Our pandemic that we have recently experienced and are still not quite out of, but we're on like seeming the tail end of things. It does make this feel a little bit different. we haven't lost people on the scale that they're speaking about here. Absolutely not. But the other impacts of having this sort of an outbreak, we have been able to see. We've had to cope with a lot of the social and economic fallout of this, and it's been quite the the social experience, and I honestly have not come to my conclusion on how I feel about everything that's going on right now. I still feel kind of shocked by the whole thing. We'll see how we feel on the way out, but it does make concepts like the plague much more interesting. I imagine people living through this period, a lot of them maybe turn to studying epidemics, pandemics, and all sorts of stuff like that a little bit more. We might have more people who take interest in learning about the plague historically because they lived through a pandemic. Like that is actually a fallout of this that I didn't really consider. But I see like people churning out books about historical fights with disease and stuff as a response to the pandemic. So now I kind of think, oh, we're in an interesting time to learn about this stuff.
And those left alive had other grimmer duties. Those struck with the plague didn't die in ways that were uniform. They fell victim to different symptoms, sometimes suffering delirium, sometimes falling into a catatonic state. Some men felt such great thirst that they would run outside, wild, and drink from the fountains until they died, their bodies half in and half out of the water. Those who slipped into a coma-like state wouldn't die immediately, not if they had somebody to tend to them. They would eat and drink if nourishment was put to their lips, which meant that many of their loved ones lived with the specter of death, caring for those they love as buboes grew and burst. And those who fell into a coma without somebody to care for them, they starved to death without even knowing. Bodies sealed in houses with no one to discover them until the stench became too great.
Having different outcomes to the disease can also make it a little bit confusing on people in general. I don't know what it was like in this particular case, but having these different outcomes, it can cause people to be unsure as to whether everybody has the same thing. I think once it hits in such a large scale, you start to realize, okay, we probably have the same thing, but like if they are having different outcomes and stuff, that can impact it and slow the response to it because they're not sure that it's as serious as it is because they don't know that everybody has the same thing.
It was said that no man was seen on the street unless he was carrying a corpse. Justinian had set up an office to handle the burials when the plague first struck, but no functionary, no office of state could keep up with the tide of death. First they filled the cemeteries, then they dug up all the open land in Constantinople to bury the dead. Then, in the state's final days of dwindling functionality, they had dug mass graves outside the walls, but soon these too were filled. Grave diggers tried to press the bodies down and pack them in. As everything unraveled, people just began to dump the bodies into the sea, which only led to bloated corpses washing up along the shore. They also tried filling boats with corpses and pushing those out into the waves. All along the Mediterranean world, ghostly ships, manned only by the dead, would find their way to the coastline, bringing a cargo of bodies riddled by the plague. Finally, the people of Constantinople took to simply packing the corpses into the
Dude, that would make an awesome, premise for a zombie story. I know this is not super related, but I feel like a lot of great fantasy and stuff is based in history and stuff, but when I see stuff like that, I'm like, that's a writing prompt right there. And if you are an aspiring writer, being interested in history is really good. A lot of the best pieces of fiction have a little bit of reality in that, because reality is much more interesting than anything that we could just come up in our heads.
Guard towers that lined its great wall. When the wind blew, the stench of decay covered the city. The queen of cities was a ghost town. Those the plague didn't kill, it often drove mad with horror or grief. Suicides increased dramatically, and all over the world, reports spread of grim apparitions, plying the waters in brazen boats, or spreading the plague by a touch of their ghostly hand. Whether they were phantoms of men's plague-addled minds, or merely the specters of fear.
It basically is a zombie
these
story.
demonic visions gave men even more reason to keep hiding behind locked doors. And with all of this happening, harvest couldn't be collected, crops rotted in the fields, and famine loomed. And the plague spared neither the old nor the young, holy men or scoundrels.
Now that I think about it, I wouldn't be surprised if zombie stories in general were inspired by the plague, though I don't know where the origins of the zombie genre of horror is. I'm not really sure, like, where you would date back the first, like, zombie book or something like that. I'm not sure. But if it's not inspired by the plague, I'd be shocked.
Rich or poor, everyone got
at least
the plague.
A little.
Everyone, including Justinian.
Oh,
The
yeah?
emperor fell into a deep coma. Soon, the buboes appeared on his thigh. Every day, the city prayed, but everyone knew the plague's course. It was here that Theodora stepped in.
Oh.
Throughout Justinian's reign, she was working behind the scenes. During the course of his rule, she had worked to find space for both Orthodox and Monophysite Christians in the empire. She had fought for the rights of women,
nice.
and she had always helped with imperial policy. On top of that, Theodora had also served as a sort of...
I want to know what fighting for the rights of women means in this time, because it always means something a little bit different. Sometimes we'll take historical figures who fought for the rights of women and we'll turn them into like modern feminist icons and stuff, but they don't necessarily reflect that. It's more kind of like the image and idea behind these powerful women. So I'm curious to where Theodora falls. I think of figures like Abigail Adams and stuff, like not a perfect feminist or whatever, but was turned into a bit of a feminist icon of the Revolutionary period. I wouldn't be surprised if Theodora gets similar treatment, like it, just by virtue of being a powerful woman.
Informal spy master for Justinian's regime, uncovering plots and fending off any internal threats to Justinian's power. In fact,
Pretty
she had
sick.
just recently forced Justinian's ruthless taxman, John the Cappadocian, into exile as a priest as punishment for his willingness to entertain a plot against the emperor. And here, now in this critical
what a
juncture,
prick.
as Justinian lay comatose, Theodora took up the fallen reins of power. And this is a remarkable thing. To think that she could do this, that she could hold all of the jackals and potential usurpers at bay. All around, there were generals with armies at their call. The empire itself was in a state of disarray. Any one of these generals could easily claim that the current regime had been forsaken by God, that the emperor had no clear heir, and by all accounts, he was weeks from death at most.
Yeah.
At no point...
That's like the first rule. He didn't, oh no, that's not good, man. Like the first rule of being an emperor is you need a male heir. Like that's like, there's all the other things you're supposed to do as a leader. That's number one. Securing the line of succession, because that's beyond you. Otherwise, there is going to be chaos going forward. If there's not a system for a succession of power, it doesn't have to be the traditional system, but if you don't have your succession of power secure, like, you're only putting off the inevitable. And honestly, sometimes it's not the emperor's fault. Sometimes it's things that are like beyond their control. Sometimes they just can't have kids or whatever, and that's rough. That's especially rough. But also this is huge. This is incredibly important, and for those who are capable of having kids, do everything that you possibly can. This cannot be put off in favor of any ambition in your own lifetime, homie. You can't do that.
Since Nika was control of the empire more tenuous.
Did they explain why
the
he
fact
wasn't
that
having
Rome,
kids?
even Eastern Rome,
I feel like they
had
might have
so
said something
often
about that
suffered
earlier.
civil wars and rebellions, it's incredible that in the midst of this plague and conflict, armies of Romans
while.
didn't array themselves against each other, spilling Roman blood to elevate some other ambitious man to the purple. But Theodora served as a unifying thread, as a continuation of Imperium. She made all the decisions
Hulking
that would
up.
normally come to Justinian. She held the court together and acted as a symbol of perseverance for a city and a nation going through unimaginable suffering. But most of all, she acted quickly and ruthlessly, bringing to heel anyone she suspected might attempt to supplant Justinian. She had
Might?
men of power arrested, she had generals recalled from their armies, and she had her courtiers listen for any sign of sedition. And through doing so, she prevented the civil war that should have come. But one of the men she'd had to recall was Belisarius. The world knew of his promise to never seek the purple while Justinian lived, but Justinian was on his deathbed. Many naturally assumed that Belisarius would simply take on the man.
Yeah, that feels like weasel language. I don't know if he necessarily meant anything by it, but like that little caveat of while he lived thing, that is weasel language, and I kind of understand why somebody would be a little bit skeptical of it from like an outside perspective. So okay, I kind of understand you want to keep a close eye on him. I don't know exactly how you want to treat somebody in this position. He's the guy with a lot of like the real power. Like there's the people making the orders or whatever, but then there's the people who have the actual military behind them, and that's often the person most capable of performing a kind of coup.
Mantle of emperor once Justinian passed. And though he had tried to quiet those rumors, numerous Roman factions had started to campaign for pushing out the existing imperial family and installing Belisarius instead. And thus, Theodora recalled him, tried him, and confiscated the vast wealth he had accumulated during his campaigns. She would later use her friendship with Belisarius' wife as an excuse to restore him to favor, but for now he was stuck cooling his heels in Constantinople, and safely removed from the power struggle, but also from the battlefield. Luckily for the Byzantines, this...
If I was a ruthless emperor type, I don't even know if you could let that guy live. He's really dangerous, like in theory. That's assuming I am this ruthless guy who has like no heart and just wants to do whatever it takes to maintain power. But also, like, if you crack down on him too hard, you could end up causing what you're trying to prevent. Even if you like killed him off, like if he has this wide array of supporters, then they might become your problem even if he's gone. So I guess putting him in a kind of limbo until Justinian's okay and until the throne is secured, that's probably the best thing you could possibly do in this case. Like I see the downsides of any alternative outweighing any sort of upsides.
This plague had struck the Persians as well. The war was by no means over, but there was a lull as each of the great empires struggled with their own internal problems and tried to keep their expensively trained troops away from the plague rather than fighting in the field.
You guys told me that guy, what was it, Khosrow? Khosrow? Something. I'll get it. Eventually, but you guys told me there's a series on him as well, and I was commenting about like this could be told from this guy's experience as well, and I genuinely, and I know that sounds like I knew something there, but I genuinely had no idea that there was also a series on this guy until you guys told me. So that's funny, isn't that funny?
And tried to keep their expensively trained troops away from the plague rather than fighting in the field. And so, for weeks, Constantinople existed in torpor, stunned and reeling from the catastrophe that had befallen it. But then, the impossible happened. Justinian woke up.
Say, honestly, this might be one of my favorites. Like, the military stuff, like, I make no secret of it. I'm not much of a military history dude. Like, it's cool in its own little bubble, but it's never been what was like natural to me. Ooh, a cholera epidemic in London. That might be a fun one to do after this. I have my my order selected for the near future, but it might be good to put on like the next poll that I end up doing. That could be really cool. What was I saying? Whatever. It doesn't matter. Whatever I was saying probably wasn't that important. Great way to sell myself, you know? Like, yeah, you're watching me, but what I'm saying isn't really that important. So what do we got for the next one? So we have a Justinian and Theodora episode, and then we just have a Justinian thing. That's rather interesting. I like the touch they did with the title there. It created some intrigue. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed this probably more than most of them because I love seeing how people respond to things that probably couldn't have been prevented. Like today. When people look at the Trump presidency, there are going to be the people who say Well, he was doing fine until COVID kicked in, but then there's going to be plenty of people who are like, well, your worth as a leader is not necessarily based on what you do during times of like relative peace or relative prosperity or whatever. It's what you do when you have to respond to adversity. It's in your judgment and stuff. And this is a similar moment for Theodora. Really, I was gonna say Justinian, but he's not in this. We'll see next part what Justinian does. But for here, this I guess this shows Theodora had some mettle when it came to being a leader. She definitely had what it took. I can't judge broadly everything she did because like we kind of skim over a lot of the details of stuff and we kind of got the big picture of her actions. I'm sure there's a much grander story to how she managed the itty bitty stuff. You could probably do a whole series on every little element that she tried to control. So yeah, that was pretty cool. So thank you guys for watching. I will be back in the near future with a little bit more of this. We just got a couple episodes left, and then we get to move on to whatever I have next. I forgot what it was. I'll know when we get there, though. I'm not looking at the poll till we're done with this one. All right. I'll see you guys next time. All right.